Estamos ao vivo.
Boa tarde a todas e todos. Como comunico com o Dr. Theotokis, que nos honra hoje com sua presença, eu falarei brevemente de sua trajetória aqui, alguns aspectos de sua trajetória em português, e depois eu apresentarei em inglês. First, I speak in Portuguese, and after, I will speak in English. Dr. Theotokis tem uma pesquisa, basicamente, o âmbito da história militar, da história do Mediterrâneo, né? Se doutorou para a Universidade de Glasgow, atualmente professor assistente na Universidade Ibn Haldun, em Istambul, né? E tem uma produção recente muito significativa, tal como a Batalha de Manzikert, a Arte da Guerra em Bizâncio, assim como editou diversos volumes relativos à história militar e história do Mediterrâneo nos séculos X e XI, com ênfase em Bizâncio e com ênfase também nos normandos. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is with great pleasure that I introduce today distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Georgios Theotokis, from Ibn Haldun University, Istanbul, Turkey. He is an expert in Byzantine studies and has made significant contributions to the field. Georgios Theotokis holds PhD from University of Glasgow and is assistant professor at Ibn Haldun University, Istanbul. He is a historian of Europe and Mediterranean Sea, and his main areas of expertise are the history of the culture of war and the ethnicity, the study of connections between major world regions, especially the Mediterranean and Western Asia, the effects of armed conflict on societies and cultures, urban response to warfare, and the diffusion of military knowledge between cultures. His latest monographs include The Campaign and Battle of Manzikert, The Art of War in Byzantium, and he was edited several collective volumes like Nicephorus' Second Focus and Warfare, in the 10th century Byzantine world, Warfare in 11th century Byzantium, and Warfare in the Norman South recently too. Today, Dr. Georgios Theotokis will share insights in how to survive amid these very savage nations, Byzantine geopolitics in the critical 10th century, offering perspectives that will deepen our understanding of the subject. Now, I will hand it over to Dr. Theotokis. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you very much for inviting me. And again, a huge congratulations for the center that you have established on the other side of the world compared to where we are now, where I am in the old world. Many thanks for the invitation. And as you have understood, my main area of expertise is the military history of the Mediterranean world, particularly Eastern Mediterranean, and the relations between Byzantium and its neighbors when it comes to warfare. But as I'm always explaining to my students, that Byzantium was a very non-bellicose state. And the ideology of Byzantium precluded it from giving an open battle. Again, this is in terms of Byzantine ideology, which the Byzantine Empire had inherited from its predecessors, the Roman Empire. And I think this idea of a non-bellicose state has been explained in a very good way and with a very catchy title by one of the greatest Byzantine military historians of the 20th and the 21st century, Warren Treadgold, who published I think it was in 2005 or in 2006, an article in a collective volume that was titled Byzantium, the Reluctant Warrior. And because Byzantium was a very reluctant warrior, that's why it survived for 1,100 years, and it outlived many other empires, including, as I explained to my Turkish students, including the Ottoman Empire. So for what I will try to explain today is I will explain the strategic role of and the strategic importance of primarily Constantinople, not the Byzantine Empire, but primarily the capital, Constantinople, and how important it was for regional geopolitics in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans, and how Byzantium tried to defend itself by using other means, and that's the whole point of, again, this Byzantine war ideology. So let me, without further ado, let me just again, share my my PowerPoint and in a wide screen. As you can see here, this is a battle scene, and it depicts on the left. It says on the top, Niki Romeon, a battalion, a cavalry battalion of the Romans attacking the Bulgarians, and from the manuscript of the illuminated manuscript of Skylitis from the 12th century in Madrid. And I will give again a description of the strategic importance of the city of Constantinople, and an extract that is taken from the work of Lutrabov, Kremoda, and Apodosis. So the Constantinopolitan city is located amidst very savage nations. Indeed, it has to its north the Hungarians, the Pizzakeni, the Patzinaks, the Khazars, the Russians, whom we call Normans by another name, and the Bulgarians, all very close by. To the east lies Baghdad. Between the east and the south, the inhabitants of Egypt and Babylonia. To the south, there is Africa, and that island called Crete, very close to and dangerous for Constantinople. Other nations that are in the same region, that is the Armenians, Persians, Chaldeans, and Avaski, serve Constantinople. In the middle of the 10th century, the Italian diplomat Lutrad of Cremona described the position of the empire accurately enough as being surrounded by the fiercest of barbarians. Yet this is precisely the image of a beleaguered state that the Byzantine self-image wanted to promote, a Christian state fighting the forces of evil. So in this paper, I will focus my attention on the 10th century, that has been dubbed as the period of the Byzantine reconquest, and I shall attempt to put together a model of negotiation and confrontation between Byzantium and its neighbors in three different geopolitical theaters, with the Arabs in the east, with the Bulgars in the west, and with the Rus and the Patzinaks in the north. The theme with which I shall be concerned here is essentially that of war and diplomacy, and I will try to figure out the delicate equilibrium between the appetite of the Byzantines for war and their willingness to negotiate by other means, i.e. diplomacy or the employment of stratagems, craft, and bribery. But first, let's clarify some key points about the role and use of war in political negotiation. War is a form of political communication, and to quote a couple of perhaps the most famous maxims in human history, war as an instrument of politics. War is not merely an act of policy, as you can see here on the top left. War is not merely an act of policy, but a true political instrument, a continuation of political intercourse, carried on with the admixture of other means. The political object is the goal, war is the means of reaching it, and means can never be considered in isolation from their purpose. That's, of course, from the Vom Kriege, the own war by Karl von Clausewitz. And then war, as you can see on the right, war is as an act of force to compel our enemy to do our will. To secure that object, we must render the enemy powerless, and that in theory is the true aim of warfare. Clausewitz, a reader of Machiavelli, and an intellectual child of Aristotle and Plato went no further than to say that man, who is a political animal, is also a war-making animal, of course. This rationale implies the existence of state entities and interests and of rational calculation about how this may be achieved, what we will call today foreign policy or strategy. And on the bottom, I have a much more modern idea about what is foreign policy or strategy. A set of ideas for employing the instruments of national power in a synchronized and integrated fashion to achieve theater, national, and/or multinational objectives, according to the US Department of Defense Dictionary of Military and Associated Terms. Yet the term strategy, coming from the Greek strategia or strategiki, had a different meaning in pre-modern times. According to an anonymous Byzantine treatise of the late 9th century AD, as you can see here on the top left, strategy, strategiki, is the means by which a commander may defend his own lands and defeat his enemies. And the author goes as far as to differentiate between two kinds of strategy: the defensive, by which a general acts to protect his own people and their property, and the offensive, by which he retaliates against his opponents. For the Byzantine emperors and high officials, there was no certain concept of grand strategy, and this is also what the ideas that I would like to share with you. The idea that Byzantium did not actually have a grand strategy, but the empire, even during periods of expansion like the Justinian Wars in the West, it was just reacting to the geopolitical situations. There was no second concept of grand strategy, at least not in a way scholars would have understood it in the 20th century, but rather a reaction to the socio-political events in the world that surrounded the empire, a sort of crisis management on a grand scale. Yet we can identify the basic interrelated strategic considerations or factors that determined the empire's strategic thinking and planning. First, the position of the empire in the wider geostrategic context of the Balkans, Asia Minor, and the Middle East, and particularly the huge strategic importance of Constantinople in the confluence of two continents. The economy and manpower of Byzantium in relation to warfare. And three, cultural approaches that affected the Byzantines' attitude towards warfare, this ideology of avoiding warfare that they inherited from the Roman Empire, combined with the notion of holy war and the defense of the empire that gradually develops after the middle of the 9th century. And we see it in the military manuals, particularly Leo's Tactica, that was written in the first decade of the 10th century. To begin with, the strategic position of the empire in Eurasia played a prominent role in its military organization and the shaping of its attitude towards its neighbors and warfare in general. In order to understand the empire's history and strategic thinking, one must appreciate the geopolitical significance of Asia Minor, and especially Constantinople, to the wider region of the Eastern Mediterranean. With its capital situated at the crossroads of Asia and Europe, inevitably it had to face different enemies in two geographical areas that were culturally and otherwise as far apart as they could be. Yet the sad reality that the emperors in Constantinople had to face was that limited resources in money and manpower constituted the waging of war in more than one theater an almost inconceivable prospect, especially since the maintaining of an active army posed a very heavy burden for any pre-industrial economy. There is no reason to doubt that at times, and in special circumstances, forces as many as 30,000 soldiers might have been raised for a specific campaign, although field armies of less than 10,000 effectives would have been the norm. Yet it was rare, and this is very important, it was rare for the imperial armies to achieve significant numerical superiority over their enemies in any operational theater. Finally, the Byzantine attitude towards warfare is neatly summed up by Emperor Leo VI words in his circa 900 AD Tactica, and I quote, "You should not endanger yourself and your army if it is not of utmost need or if you're not to have major gains. because these people who do this, they greatly resemble those who have been deceived by gold. And I have similar quotations from other major works, what we call today military manuals. In the top, I have a quotation from Vegetus.
Excuse me, Dr. Theotokis.
Yes.
I'm sorry. The slides aren't advancing. We are viewing the edition mode, not the presentation mode. It would be great if you could close and reopen in presentation.
So you cannot see my PowerPoints. Let's see. Yeah, I shared my screen.
Let's try.
Let's try again. So I'm opening again. I thought you were able to see my my slides. Can you see them now?
No. Yes. Now.
No.
I'm seeing.
Now?
Yes.
I'm changing. Okay.
Please click in presentation mode.
Not a slide. So. Yes. So here, can you see that I'm
That's fine.
changing?
Perfect.
Okay. Apologies for that. Yeah. Again, I will tell you when I'm changing to another slide in case there is a mistake again. Okay. So let's. I will go back to the beginning of this part. Yeah. So finally, the Byzantine attitude towards warfare is neatly summed up by Emperor Leo VI's words in his Tactica that was written probably in the first decade of the 10th century. You should not endanger yourself and your army if it is not of utmost need or if you are not to have any major gains, because these people who do this, they greatly resemble those who have been deceived by gold. So battle avoidance, as it is explained by Leo's Tactica, and here you can read in the top and the bottom. You can read similar extracts from Vegetus's Epitome, and at the bottom from Morris's Strategicon, perhaps the most influential Byzantine military treatise written about the year 600, compared to Karl von Clausewitz's own war. What they simply say, and what the Byzantines had adopted and inherited from the Romans, is that battle should be avoided because battle was risky. Battle was risky, and this is what I compare here, and I have kept the original in Latin and in Greek, the original words, because of fortune, fortuna, because of luck, and because here it is very risky. This is what Morris in his Strategicon highlights, the stichuses, or what Karl von Clausewitz may call the fog of war, although the right terminology is friction. That is why battle should be avoided at all costs, or should be the last option. Hence, the Byzantine officers were professionals who saw battle as the chance to achieve their objectives using every means possible, fair or unfair. Undoubtedly, influenced to a large extent by Christian ethics and the Roman imperial tradition, the prevailing attitude of the Byzantines, or at least that of the dominant cultural elite of the capital, was to praise the use of diplomacy, the paying of subsidies, and the employment of stratagems, craft, wiles, bribery, and other means to deceive the enemy and bring back the army with as few casualties as possible. A strategy of non-engagement that made perfect sense in military terms. The many cogs of Byzantine diplomacy would work overtime to prevent any armed conflict between the empire and its neighbors, and historians have identified two basic elements in the conduct of imperial diplomacy: delay in responding to military aggression and negotiation, and B, careful surveillance of the barbarians and speed in responding to any political changes in their power structures. Therefore, wherever possible, the emperors preferred either to avoid war, hoping for plague, starvation, or the breakup of the enemy host to do the job for them, and or to negotiate with or pay off the aggressor. When this policy of battle avoidance fell short, of course, the state would resort to arms. But even then, these were often the arms of friends, in inverted commas, friends, that were very meticulously negotiated. This is especially obvious on the northern operational theater, where, to counterweight the threat coming from the Bulgars or the Patzinaks, for example, the state could invoke the threat of arms of other nomads further east, such as the Magyars or the Cumans, or of feared people such as the Kievan Rus. Thus, when Simeon of Bulgaria defeated a hastily assembled Byzantine army outside Adrianople in 894, and with the Anatolian armies engaged in fending off raids by the Arabs of Tarsus, I quote, "Divine providence," well, it was actually Leo VI, led the Turks, meaning the Magyars, in place of the Romans to campaign against the Bulgarians. This is in the Tactica of Leo VI, in one of the last chapters, Constitution 18. In a letter to Prince George of Abbasia, modern Abkhazia and the Caucasus, the Patriarch Nicholas I Mystikos commented on the ongoing war against Simeon of Bulgaria that, and I quote, "You, George, in accordance with the imperial requirement and declaration, and holding fast to the integrity of your friendship, be constant in your readiness to fight with us, should need invoke." This is one of his letters, letter number 162, that he sent to the Prince George of Abbasia. It seems that the Patriarch's direct threat, addressed to Simeon in a letter, to incite every race, and I quote again, "every race to your destruction," Simeon's destruction, in a letter number 23, was again no empty threat. So again, we see here the Byzantines negotiating the weapons of friends against their foes. So the weapons of the Abbasians against their direct threat, that was Simeon of Bulgaria. By a geographical accident, the most advanced nation in Christendom happened to live cheek by jowl in the west and north with some exceedingly primitive and savage nations, many of whom were still living nomadic lives, like the aforementioned Patzinaks and the Cumans. And so the key to understand the different levels of dealing and negotiating with these neighboring people lies in a map. And I change here. I hope you can see the map that I have. Because the only formidable barrier between these nations and the empire's political, social, and religious center, Constantinople, was the river Danube. Geography itself dictated the levels of threat posed by different people encroaching on the Bosphorus. Therefore, in the 10th century, Byzantium's way of assuring a modicum of control over the barbarians to the north of the Danube was a slender combination of different means of diplomacy, that's soft military power, and B, the building of fortifications, hard military power. The Kievan Rus made their first appearance in the Theodosian walls of the city with a spectacular military siege in the year 860 that, according to Patriarch Photius in his homilies, caused a palpable shock to the people and their leadership. The Rus raiders did not penetrate the walls, but ravaged the suburbs, thus opening a long chapter of threats, alliance, more raids, alliance, conversion to Christianity, and outright wars. From then on, the Byzantines feared both the attacks on their capital and the Rus settlement of the Black Sea coast, yet as long as they could remain behind the Danube, the situation seemed manageable. In their dealings with the Rus princes, the Byzantines took them very seriously and often treated them with respect and pomp, which in turn enhanced the prestige of the Rus princes in the eyes of their aristocrats and subjects. This fear and fascination feeling was certainly mutual, but it seems rather surprising considering the vast distances between where the Rus lived, in modern Ukraine and Belarus, and the Byzantine capital. It was more, as I mentioned earlier, a shock about this sudden appearance outside the usually sparsely defended imperial capital of a people that possessed the very basic rudimentary naval technology to navigate the Russian rivers and the Black Sea in order to arrive and besiege Constantinople. Nonetheless, it seems that in treating with these newcomers, and in particular in negotiating with their leaders, the Byzantines not only helped to develop in the Russians the concept of nation, according to Jonathan Shepherd, and to encourage the Russian princes to acquire the rudiments of a more complicated method of rule and legislation, but they also stood to gain a great deal, of course. The Russians were able to supply them with the produce of their northern forests, like furs, wax, honey, and perhaps timber, but also slaves and elite warriors, as we know from the Varangian Guard later on. In its aftermath, we find treaties being drawn between the Emperor Michael III and the Russians in the year 866 and 868, where it is clearly noted down that troops should be sent to the emperor's personal service. Following the second Russian siege of Constantinople in the year 907, one of the terms of the treaty that was agreed in 911, according to the Russian primary chronicle, and I quote, "Wherever you, the Byzantines, find it necessary to declare war, providing any Rus desirous of honoring your emperor, they shall be permitted in this respect to act according to their desire." This Russian-Byzantine Treaty of 911 was further developed into a treaty of alliance after the Russian siege of Constantinople in the year 941, where we read again in the Russian primary chronicle, "And if our Byzantine Empire needs military assistance, we shall write to you, great Prince Igor, and he shall send us as many troops as we require." Yet the latter, the latter treaty, included a term that revealed Byzantium's concern about Russian encroachment on the Black Sea coast. In the matter of the country of Kherson, in the Black Sea, and all the cities in that region, the Prince of the Rus shall not have the right to harass these localities, nor shall that district be subject to you. So we see the first instance of the Byzantines being worried about the expansion of the Rus on the north coast of the Black Sea, and particularly their outpost in the Chersonesus, as you can see here in the Crimea. The Rus princes do not seem systematically to have claimed the title or authority of an emperor. However, it is well known how alarmed the Byzantines were by the Russian prince's Sviatoslav's attempts to establish himself south of the Danube, after he was invited by the Emperor Nicephorus II Phocas in the year 965 to plunder Bulgaria in order to draw him away from Kherson in the Black Sea coast. The emperor was apparently hoping that the Russians and the Bulgarians would exhaust one another, but he did not visualize any other consequences. Russian primary chronicle in the year 969 writes, and I quote, "Sviatoslav announced to his mother Olga and his boyars, 'I do not care to remain in Kiev, but should prefer to live in Pereyaslavets in the Paradunavion along the Danube, in the Danube Delta, since that is the center of my realm, where all riches are concentrated, gold, silk, wine, and various fruits from Greece, silver and horses from Hungary and Bohemia.'" Then there is a specific mechanism of geopolitical deterrence, which reflected the very peculiar distribution of power. In this case, Kievan Rus, with their boats, could control the rivers Dnieper down to the Black Sea, but not the vast steppe on either side, and the emperors could make use of neighboring peoples to attack dangerous enemies from behind. And again, I changed my slide here. Nor can the Russians come at Constantinople, either for war or for trade, unless they are at peace with the Pechenegs. Because when the Russians come with their boats to the barrages of the river Dnieper, they cannot pass through unless they lift their boats off the river and carry them past by portaging them on their shoulders, then The Pechenegs set upon them, attack them, and they are easily routed. And this is an extract from Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus' De Administrando Imperio, written around the middle of the 10th century, describing again the geopolitical situation in the north, to the north of the river Danube. Sviatoslav's defeat of the Pechenegs at Kiev in the year 968 made an imperial military intervention inevitable. Emperor John Tzimiskis, his crushing of Sviatoslav's army at Paradunavion in the year 971, tilted the balance back in favor of the empire. The treaty was signed. Sviatoslav was to be allowed to depart in peace up the Danube as a friend of the empire. Trade between the two states was to be restored. The Russian prince promised he would not return to Bulgaria again and would leave Kherson in peace. But early in the year 972, so the following year, and while Sviatoslav was returning to Kiev, he was killed by a group of Pechenegs, probably in the service of the emperor. After the war of 968 to 71, Emperor Tzimiskis' strategic goal on the Danube was to restore the solidity of the Danube frontier by what I mentioned earlier, diplomacy, soft military power, and the building of fortifications, hard military power. The main diplomatic action was the alliance with the Pechenegs, even though relations with them would develop in a way different from that John had envisaged. On the other hand, the building activity along the Danube consisted of the restoration of several old Roman forts and the erection of new ones at strategic points, while around this time the Mesopotamia of the West was established as a military and administrative unit. So the Ducate of the Mesopotamia of the West was established in the lower Danube. Finally, one of the main reasons why the Byzantines sought to convert the Russians to Christianity, according to Jonathan Shepherd, was their despair of the Russians' breach of the treaties. Chronicles speak of their disregard for the treaties in the context of 941 and 971, and the Byzantines made sure to insert some special provisions about eternal damnation in the Treaty of 944 for Russians who were Christians. For example, if any inhabitant, this is a quotation from the Russian primary chronicle, if any inhabitant of the lands of Rus thinks to violate this amity, may such of these transgressors as have adopted the Christian faith incur condign punishment from Almighty God in the shape of damnation and destruction forevermore. Byzantine dealings with the Russian princes were certainly complicated, but entailed no existential threat for the empire. That was also true of the Muslim Arabs after the failure of their second siege of Constantinople in the year 718. In spite of periodic scares, such as in 824, when the Arabs in flight from Umayyad Spain conquered Crete, or the Emperor Theophilus' defeat by the Abbasids at the Battle of Dazimun in western Anatolia in the year 838. These were not existential threats for Byzantium. Bulgaria, however, was different. Because it was so close to Constantinople, its power was a deadly threat whenever crisis on another front denuded the empire's manpower and resources. The very existence of a Bulgarian state south of the Danube River was necessarily a threat to the survival of the empire, regardless of its strength or weakness. For across the Danube, there was a vastness of the Eurasian steppe, from which several nomadic people had and would arrive, potentially turning Bulgaria into a gateway, some sort of a gateway, into the southern Balkans. The Bulgarians could never have been a reliable ally for the Byzantines, axiomatically. If they were strong enough to defend the Danube frontier themselves, they would necessarily be a threat to Constantinople as well. If they were too weak, not only they, but Constantinople would be in danger. Only a Bulgaria both strong and obedient could have been a desirable neighbor for Byzantium. But that improbable coincidence would only occur very briefly and only in times of transition. So in the year 965, when Bulgarian envoys appeared at the court of Nicephorus II Phocas to collect the annual tribute owed by the Byzantines according to the terms of the peace treaty with Tsar Peter I, agreed in 927, Emperor Nicephorus flew into a rage that the lowly Bulgarians would dare ask for a tribute. It is clear, therefore, that warfare was not necessarily conducted with a purely material advantage in mind, since ideological superiority played an important role in Byzantine political ideology. Nicephorus thus replied to the Bulgarian envoys, "It would be a dreadful fate now to befall the Romans, who destroy their every foe with armed force, if they would have to pay tribute like captives to the particularly wretched and abominable Scythian people," referring, of course, to the Bulgarians. He turned to his father, who was sitting next to him, Vardas, who had the rank of a Caesar, the title of a Caesar. He asked him in perplexity what was the reason for the exaction of tribute that the Mysians, again referring to the Bulgarians, were demanding from the Romans. "Did you unawares beget me as a slave? Shall I, the revered emperor of the Romans, be reduced to paying tribute to a most wretched and abominable people?" Therefore he ordered that the ambassadors be immediately slapped in the face and said, "Go tell your leather-gnawing ruler, who is clad in a leather jerkin, that the most mighty and great emperor of the Romans is coming immediately to your land to pay you the tribute in full, so that you may learn, oh, you who are thrice a slave through your ancestry, to proclaim the rulers of the Romans as your masters and not to demand tribute of them as if they were slaves." And this is the testament of Leo the Deacon in his history, book 4. The third quarter of the 10th century was a period of extraordinary Byzantine military success. This is the period of the Byzantine reconquest, Byzantine Reconquista, against the Arabs in the east. And Nicephorus could be excused for acting in this manner against the Bulgarian envoys because of his successes in the east. But since the humiliating recognition of Khan Asparuk's first Bulgarian state in the Paradonavium, as you can see here on the left, following the disastrous Battle of Ongal in the year 680, the policy of a succession of emperors towards the Bulgars suggests that the warfare on this front was never more than a holding action, defensive action, broken only by occasional periods of peace. John Haldun believes that the imperial government had been thoroughly redesigned to the existence of the Bulgarian state, especially following the Byzantine devastating defeat at Pliska in the year 811, and the effort to convert the Khan, the Bulgar Khan, and his court in the 9th century was as much a response to the need to find alternative ways of taming, controlling a potentially dangerous neighbor by utilizing the church for its own political ends, especially against the growing influence of Rome in this area. Yet this effort entailed another danger. After Khan Boris's conversion in 865, every Tsar could dream of becoming emperor of all Christians, once they were recognized as emperors in the first place. It would be Simeon who would aspire to this title. He was the second son of Boris, sent to Constantinople at the age of 13, and spending almost a decade there studying between 878 and 888. What will be unique in Simeon's case is that he was not seeking plunder. He wanted nothing less than the crown. On top of that, it was once confidently asserted that for Simeon, even crown and title were not enough, and that his higher ambition was to be enthroned as the emperor of Byzantium and Bulgaria in Constantinople. That has now been disputed by Stephenson, And we now believe that Simeon would more likely have wanted three things from Byzantium: trade, tribute, and recognition of his imperial title as Emperor of the Bulgarians. He arrived with his army outside the capital in 913 and began negotiating via envoys with the regent Nikolaos Mystikos to the underage emperor Constantine VII. And in this famous meeting between the two outside the Theodosian walls of Constantinople, the patriarch performed a ceremony involving a crown and a public acclamation, and arranged for the Emperor Constantine to marry Simeon's daughter. Thereafter, Simeon began to use the title Vasilevs, most likely of the Bulgarians. This transition is apparent in the changing official seals used by Simeon, and here's another the next slide. And according to finds in Veliki Preslav, in Great Preslav, in northeastern Bulgaria, from 2008, an archaeological team led by Associate Professor Margarita Vaklinova and Associate Professor Irina Stereva, I think I'm pronouncing her name correctly, discovered a lead seal of Tsar Simeon from his earlier period, 893 to 917, with depictions of Jesus Christ here on the left, and the Virgin Mary, and an inscription, Simeon, Archon of the Bulgarians, ruler of the Bulgarians. In 2010, the team, led by Professor Irina Stereva, discovered another lead seal of Tsar Simeon from his later period, 917 to 927, with a depiction of Tsar Simeon and an inscription reading, Simeon in Christ Vasilevs of the Romans, here on the bottom right. On the one side, and a depiction of Jesus Christ and an inscription reading, to the victor Simeon for many years on the other. So we see that he changed his title. Simeon had two different types of seals, corresponding to the two different periods of his reign, before and after the critical battle of Anchialos in the year 917 AD, in which his forces wiped out almost an entire Byzantine army of some 62,000 troops. And the first type of seals date from between 893 and 917, when he signed as Archon, while the second type date from between 917 and his death in 927, when he signed as Vasilevs, i.e. Emperor of the Bulgarians and the Romans. And in the Book of Ceremonies, also penned during the reign of Constantine Porphyrogenitus, Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus in the middle of the 10th century, it also records this transition from God-appointed Archon, prince, ruler of Bulgaria, to the later protocol, confirmed during the reign of Simeon's successor Peter, Peter I. Constantine and Romanos, pious autocrats, emperors of the Romans in Christ, who is God, to our desired spiritual son, the Lord Vasilevs of Bulgaria. So that was the title addressed to Peter, the son of Simeon. Following the death of Simeon in 927, the status quo that would prevail between Byzantium and Bulgaria in the period between 927 and 959 was based on a mutual desire to ensure continued stability and to eliminate the nomad threat of the Patzinaks and the Magyars to both empires. Therefore, to appreciate Nikiphoros's maltreatment of the Bulgarian envoys in 967, we need to understand that the Byzantine emperor had altered his attitude to the Bulgarian Tsar after he was raised to the throne in 963, after he had become emperor in 963. During this period, he significantly improved his contacts with the various peoples settled beyond Bulgaria. A series of arrangements were made with the Magyar chieftains to reduce their raids in 934, 43, 59, etc. Trade was encouraged beyond the Danube to ensure socioeconomic stability, and new contacts with the Rus of Kiev sought to exploit their greed for precious goods and metals. It is therefore explicable, understandable, that soon after his accession, the militant emperor Nicephorus Phocas decided that he was in a position to renegotiate the peace of 927 with Tsar Peter. However, his commitment to the war against the Arabs in the East precluded a direct military intervention because, as we know, the Eastern operational theater take priority over the Balkans. The dire situation south of the Danube had to be resolved when the Russians were invited to attack the Bulgarians from the north by force of arms, and the conquest of Antioch in 969, coupled with John Tzimiskis' murder of Emperor Nicephorus, dramatically changed this geopolitical and political situation in the region within only 2 years. John Tzimiskis' swift and sweeping military success against the Rus in the year 970 and 71, and the conquest of Bulgaria became central to the legitimation of his authority, which culminated in the ritual humiliation of Tsar Boris II in Constantinople, where his authority and the symbols of it were absorbed within the imperial hierarchy, and the independent realm of Bulgaria was absorbed into the Byzantine ecumeny. Essentially, Bulgaria became a part of the Byzantine Empire. It was absorbed, was annexed by the Byzantine Empire. Yet a so-called revolt of the Kometopoli that broke out in western Bulgaria shortly after John's death in 976 confirms Byzantium's geostrategic concern about this troublesome neighbor. Because of the civil war that ensued in the empire for more than a decade after 976, coupled with a series of military defeats inflicted by the new Bulgarian ruler Samuel, Emperor Basil II resorted to the familiar diplomatic tactics that had served the empire well in the past. He negotiated an alliance with the Rus prince Vladimir. Thus, to secure the return of a recently captured Black Sea town of Kherson in the Crimea, and a detachment of Russian warriors, the famous Varangian Guard, Basil was obliged to offer the greatest prize at his disposal, his sister, the Porphyrogeniti, in marriage to Vladimir. But it would only take the agreement of an alliance with the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim in the year 1001 to free Basil to turn west against the Bulgars in a prolonged, systematic, and bloody recovery of strongholds and territories. So in a sense, diplomatic negotiations was what allowed Basil II to focus his attention in the Balkans. Diplomatic negotiations first with the Russian Prince Vladimir that ensured particularly the military reinforcements of the Varangian Guard, but also diplomatic negotiations with the Fatimid Caliph, that was the main enemy of the Byzantines in the east, al-Hakim. So once the eastern operational theater was pacified, that was a peace that lasted for a significant number of years, 15, only then Basil II was able to focus on the secondary operational theater, those the Balkans against Bulgaria. So when we study Byzantium's strategic aims and military thinking in the Eastern theater of operations in the 10th century, we have to include the Byzantine concept of restitutio imperii, the restitution of the empire, or the recovery of the former imperial lands, but also the ideologically charged war against the Muslim Arabs. So that's another difference. We have the concept of holy war that always characterized war between Byzantium and its eastern foes, its eastern enemies. Dealing with a neighboring empire whose faith committed her to holy war against Byzantium were bound to differ greatly from those with more or less impoverished barbarians from the steppes. And this is also what the Byzantines thought. They thought that and this is highlighted in Leo's Tactica, that the war against the eastern foes is in a sense more honorable than that war in the West. It somehow has more honor because it has this added element of holy war. you're fighting for your religion. So, but when it came to diplomatic relations with the Muslim caliphates, a state of war was considered to be the norm between the two powers, and peace was very much an exception, although occasionally a truce was agreed. The main concerns on both sides being the exchange of prisoners and the declaration of, or the threat of, declaring war rather than any major invasion. Therefore, according to Hugh Kennedy, diplomatic contacts between Byzantium and the caliphates were most of the time irregular and unsophisticated, while the diplomacy was essentially reactive and prophylactic, in a sense that it simply reacted to changing political events rather than attempt to initiate them. And it was designed to thwart any immediate attacks rather than lay the foundations for a long-term expansion. There are brief records of embassies between Constantinople and Baghdad in 924, 927-28, 937-38, and finally in 942-43. Diplomatic contacts ceased thereafter because the caliphs were now completely powerless and not worth doing business with. They were under the influence of the Buyids, a Shia dynasty. And after 945, power in Baghdad and in southern Iraq, as I said, was effectively in the hands of a family of Persian origin. Yet paradoxically, the Byzantine government's diplomatic and military focus in the first half of the 10th century was not in Syria, but rather in Armenia. That was the focus of the empire. And that is a paradox, because the most dangerous political enemy and military enemy of the empire was in the southeastern borders, but the diplomatic efforts of the empire were focusing in the northeast, in Armenia. Why? And this is the next slide. And I quote from the De Administrando Imperio of Constantine Porphyrogenitus. If these three cities, Chliat, Arzes, and Perkri, to the north of the Lake Van, as you can see here in Greater Armenia, are in the possession of the emperor, an Arab army cannot come out against Romania because they are between Romania and Armenia and serve as a barrier and as a military hold, aplicta, for armies. And this is perhaps one of the most significant statements for the strategic aims of the Byzantine governments in the 10th century, written between the years 948 and 52, the De Administrando Imperio, how to administer an empire. It highlights not just the strategic importance of Armenia to the eastern frontiers of the empire, but also the strategic importance of the fortress towns around Lake Van and the Diyarbakir, as you can see here on the right map, as a sort of a buffer zone, buffer states between Armenia and the Caliphate. And chapters 43 and 46 of the De Administrando Imperio, this is an extract from chapter 44, present a detailed account of the castra, the castles, and the local family connections in the principalities of Armenia proper, demonstrating Emperor Constantine VII's special interest in the internal politics and family connections of the Armenian Naxarars, the princes. And I'm getting towards the end. Just 5 more minutes, I think. But if Armenia was strategically far more important to the Byzantine government than Cilicia and Syria, then how can we explain the paradox of the extensive territorial gains on the other side of the empire's eastern frontiers in Cilicia in the third quarter of the 10th century? So in a sense, Armenia was much more important for Byzantium. Then why did the Byzantines expanded in Syria? That's the main question that the Byzantine historians were pondering since the 1990s. It all comes down to the personal, and as these were interconnected, political image of the Byzantine emperor as a sovereign chosen by God to protect his people. It's all about ideology. In the opening years of his rule as a sole emperor, Constantine VII staked his prestige on recovering Crete, the island of Crete, thus putting himself in the tradition of his father's policy, Leo VI, to recapture the island. But because his Cretan campaign of 949 was to end in a disaster for the Byzantines, it would be humiliating and politically damaging for the emperor's prestige that it would make a great impression on the nobility and the people of the island, of the capital, Constantinople. This situation was followed in the 950s, the middle of the 10th century, by an equally disastrous period of raids conducted by the emerging Emir of Aleppo, and you can see here in the map, the Emirate of Aleppo, neighboring the Emirate of Mosul. These were two brothers heading both Emirates. Saif Abdallah heading the Emirate of Aleppo, and Nasir Abdallah, his older brother, heading the Emirate of Mosul, which would result in some of the most spectacular and humiliating defeats of Byzantine arms for many decades. But since the Byzantine strategy of the period was clearly defensive and did not involve any kind of territorial expansion, then to return to my question, how can we explain the extensive gains of territory in Cilicia and Syria in the following decades? The answer lies in the propaganda war against an emerging enemy of the empire in the east, the sword of the dynasty. This is the translation of his name, Saif Abdallah, the sword of the dynasty. And in the next slide, you can see how this propaganda picked up and compounded the warfare between the two states, the Byzantine Empire and the Emirate of Aleppo, as fighting states, fighting holy war against each other. Here on the left, you see an imperial military oration that was read to the soldiers, allegedly written by the emperor, and read to the soldiers in the year 950. And on the right, a panegyric, we can say in a sense a propaganda poem written in honor of Saif Abdallah. So one attacking the other. With confidence in this hope in Christ, as you can see on the left, and after entrusting your souls to it, you have set up such trophies as these against the enemy. You have striven for such victories as these, which have reached every corner of the world and have made you famous not only in your native lands, but also in every city. Now your wondrous deeds are on every tongue, and every ear is roused to hear them. And again, this is an imperial military oration that was read out to the imperial troops, probably in October 950, just before these troops were demobilized for the season and returned to their winter quarters. And between the composition of this oration on the left, Byzantine oration, and the famous battle of the Hadad, one of the most famous battles between the Byzantine Empire and the army of the Emirate of Aleppo in the year 954, Constantine attempted to make overtures to Saif Abdallah. He tried to negotiate some sort of a peace with Saif Abdallah, and these were defiantly rebuffed by the emir, and instead they were used by his court poet Mutanabi. And here's the just a part of the panegyric, propaganda poem, to enhance Saif Abdallah's stance in the Muslim world as a fighter for the jihad. And we can read from 24 to 34, the verses 24 to 34. So on one day with horsemen you drive the Byzantines from them, and on another day with bounty you drive away poverty and dearth. Your expeditions are continuous, and the domesticos, that the Byzantine general, is in flight, his companions slain and his properties plundered. You stood your ground when death was not in doubt for anyone who did so. But he, the domesticus, the Byzantine general, turned his back when the thrusting waxed furious, when his soul remembered the sharpness he felt his flank. And he abandoned the virgins, the patriarchs, and the townships, the disheveled Christians, the courtiers, and the crosses. Dare he, the domesticus, always attack you when his neck was always reproaching his face? Mutanabi's poetry also does not involve any notion of territorial expansion. The main objective of the emir is the defeat and humiliation of his enemies. It is from this period of the middle of the 950s, possibly 955, that we can remark the beginning of a new policy of Constantine VII to raise the stakes, to make the stance of the empire even more aggressive in his conflict with Saif Abdallah of Aleppo. The proliferation of military treatises, we have more military works that are written in this period. The dismissal of the aging domestic of the Schole, of the aging general Vardas Phokas, and the ritual humiliation of one of Saif Abdallah's cousins that was caught as a prisoner of war in the capital in 956. This was a war of propaganda, which by the end of the 950s had already escalated into an all-out conflict between the emperor and the emir of Aleppo, where no one could politically afford to back down. So to conclude, the foreign policies formulated by successive governments in Constantinople, which were based on the extensive use of non-bellicose means before resorting to conflict, were a product of what we may call political pragmatism in the medieval Roman Empire. In short, any means that guaranteed the empire's status quo, including diplomacy, bribery, trickery, and other means, was preferable, and in a very cold and calculating way, it was cheaper and less risky than military action. War then should be understood as the penultimate means of political negotiation, a true political instrument in a very Clausewitzian manner, a continuation of political discussion, political intercourse. Therefore, the empire's defensive strategic thinking should not be overshadowed by expansionist wars, such as those that were conducted in the 10th century, or like Justinian's wars of the 6th century, that were a result of an unexpectedly favorable strategic situation, which proves that the imperial governments were capable of understanding when the equilibrium of power favored the conduct of war in a specific operation or theater. Finally, the basic considerations that shaped the empire's strategic thinking and planning or reacting in the 10th century included the capital's geopolitical location in the confluence of two continents, the state's reliance on agriculture and the economy's reaction to warfare, and the Byzantine's cultural approaches to warfare, including the notion of holy war. All three were interrelated and helped define and develop a sort of strategic thinking for the empire that raised awareness over material considerations and the state's limited ability to face enemies in different operational theaters at the same time. So basically, this is what made the Byzantine think twice when they had to face two enemies in two different operational theaters. They couldn't do that. The Muslims in the East always took precedence in the state's strategic priorities in an apparent war of propaganda that involved grandiose claims of impending recovery of the Christian holy places or the destruction of Islamic cult centers. Fighting the barbarians in the Balkans and north of the Danube was regarded as much less prestigious and glorious than combating the religious foe in the East. It was, however, a matter of life and death the closer an enemy got to the capital, and Byzantium's way of assuring a modicum of control over the barbarians in the Balkans and to the north of the Danube was a very slender combination of different means of diplomacy, soft military power, and ruthless military force when things were getting out of hand, the hard military power. Thank you very much.
Lecture. Thank you so much. And I hope this is the first opportunity for many other exchanges Now I will hand it to Professor Marchini. He will be some questions. Professor Marchini, please.
You're muted.
Dirceu, tá mudo.
I'm sorry. Congratulations on your presentation, Dr. Theotokis. This is a very interesting topic. We were able to learn a lot from you today. If you don't mind, I will translate some questions that were asked in the YouTube chat, okay?
Very good.
Herbert Santos asked the following. Since the 3rd century, the Roman Empire dealt, according to historiography, with an idea of crisis and rupture that should be combated. How did this perception continue in the 10th century? And how did the Byzantine react to it?
I think there was an interruption, and I didn't hear the beginning of the question. I'm very sorry.
Okay, I will write the question in the private chat, okay?
Since the 3rd century, the Roman Empire dealt, according to historiography, with an idea of crisis and rupture that should be combated. How did this perception continue in the 10th century, and how did the Byzantines react to it? The Byzantines were always felt like they were the beleaguered empire. They always felt that they were and this is reflected in the Byzantine military manuals, the military treatises like Morris's Strategicon, written around 600. And then this is also, I don't want to say copied, but again, reflected in Leo's Tactica and in the rest of the military manuals of the 10th century, that there was this idea of crisis and the idea that, the empire was on the verge of total collapse. And this is in one sense, that was reality, but we can also say that this was a rhetorical topos, so kind of a literary tool that the Byzantines were using from Latin literature. The kind of the terminology that I used in my latest article, rhetorical complaining. They were complaining all the time that they were in the defensive, and the empire is in crisis, and we have to defend ourselves from all these enemies, old enemies, new enemies, etc., etc. And in the military manuals of the 10th century, this is repeated to a large scale. So they are repeating the same ideas, which are in a sense, again, literary topics or literary tools, but the Byzantines are using that to display the fact that they consider themselves to be in the defensive. They are the chosen people of God who are in the defensive, and they are always, they would always choose not to fight the war like good Christians, but they have to defend their holy empire. In a sense, they are obliged to go into a defensive holy war, because any war in Byzantium is a holy war, because it is sanctioned by the Byzantine emperor, in order to defend themselves. So again, I don't know if I made it clear, but yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. João Dias asked.
How can the 10th century Byzantine geopolitics be connected to the backdrop of internal politics in which factions of military officers vied for power, often sharing the throne with the Macedonians? This is a very good question, especially for the the period between the beginning of the expansionist wars of the 10th century, so let's say the 940s, with a very famous general, John Kourkouas, and these expansionist wars that are that take off during the leadership, both military and political leadership of the famous family of the Focaves in the 10th century, and how these families devastated the empire during the civil wars of the first period of the reign of Basil II in the 970s and in the 980s, that caused the empire great trouble and territorial contraction. So the 10th century is a period that is dominated by, and Byzantine geopolitics, okay, is dominated by these Byzantine families, and by the 10th century, the Byzantine Empire had already realized the great danger that these families were beginning to play for the state and for the army, and it would be Basil II in the second part of his reign, when he was the undisputed leader, emperor of Byzantium, where he would try to curb the power of these families. So again, these factors are inextricably linked. I mean, you cannot talk about Byzantine geopolitics without referring to these families. These families were responsible for enlarging the empire, but they were also responsible for many of the troubles that befell the empire. Thank you.
Thank you. We have more questions. I will select a few. Guilherme, please present Dr. Fabiano Fernandes' question on the screen. Guilherme?
So how in the 10th century was the fight against barbarians who had become Christians justified? What were the interfaces between faith and war in the Byzantine Empire of the 10th century? This is a very important and a very long topic that will take us into the realms of holy war in Byzantium. And as we know, the Byzantine Empire had a very different notion of holy war from the Crusaders. That was closer to the Muslim jihad. I mean, it had more parallels with the Muslim jihad. And Yanis Turaitis has written some very, for those in your audience who are interested, has written some very interesting articles on this topic, and how the Byzantines tried to portray the war against the Christian barbarians who belonged to this Byzantine ecumeny in this kind of a the term Byzantine ecumeny was used in order to depict, to refer to this enlarged Byzantine sphere of influence. For example, with the Bulgarians who were Christians and they were within the Byzantine ecumeny, it was portrayed in the letters of the Patriarch Nikolaos Mystikos as a Byzantine civil war. It was a civil war between fellow Christians. And actually, when Leo VI, the Emperor Leo VI, ordered attacks, he had to stop his attacks against the Arabs in order to deal with Simeon of Bulgaria in Thrace, in Antianople. He was very reluctant to order his troops to fight the Bulgarians because he didn't want to Christians killing Christians. And his work, his Tactica, reflects this notion of how fighting against fellow Christians is considered something not exactly sinful, let's say, but something very, very bad. But again, this is a very long discussion, but this was very critical for the empire in the 10th century, and that is why the operational theater against the Arabs in the East was far more important and far more prestigious and honorable than fighting some, Bulgarians in Thrace or Macedonia or some Rus in the Paradunavian. Much more prestigious. Much less prestigious in the Balkans and much more prestigious when you were also fighting for the glory of God.
Thank you.
Okay, it's very interesting. Finally, we have questions from our colleague Guilherme. Please, Guilherme, present the questions on the screen.
In Psellos' chronographia, there is a strong critique of expansionism as a foreign policy during difficult times. Psellos harshly criticizes Romanos Argyros, using him as a symbol. Yeah. Throughout the work, however, Psellos advocates for a defensive policy and uses Isaac Komnenos as a parallel to this. Setting aside the specific historical context, are there similar criticism by some authors in earlier periods, such as the 10th century? That's a good question. I mean, Psellos, first of all, we must consider that Psellos has his own agenda. He has his own political agenda, and he knows what to criticize. And he criticized Romanus III because Romanus III was, I want to use a polite term, he was a very reckless emperor who tried to expand in Syria in, I think, 1030. He led a very irresponsible and a failed campaign in northern Syria, I think. But also, Isaac Komnenos, that he uses as an example, was a very strong and the first military leader after Basil II in Byzantium, Isaac Komnenos. To go back to the 10th century, no, I have to say that I don't have any example that would come to my mind at the moment where there is where there is a historian or a chronicler who is criticizing the emperor's foreign policy. No, I have to say no. Nothing comes to mind, at least. But that's a very good question. That's a very good question. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor. It's an honor. Your lecture today is important for us. It's very difficult study Byzantine themes in Brazil. Perhaps in the future we can firm connections in others academics possibilities. Okay.
Yes, we will be happy, and I'm working for a university that has been established in 2016, and it's looking to expand its connections.
Okay.
So, I mean, feel free to include us in any plans that you might have. We have a very strong history department, and we have many strong. Well, I'm the only Byzantinist, but we have many strong Ottoman historians as well. So, I mean, if you're interested, we can keep in touch and we can expand our collaboration.
We'll keep in touch. Thank you so much. Thank you for Professor Marchini, my friend and colleague. A double situation, it's important situation for. He is a hardworking person. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's an honor. It's an honor. Thank you very much for inviting me, and best of luck to all of you, and best of luck to the center. Thank you very much. Thank you.
See you soon, I think.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. No final